So today we're talking about building an anti-racist organization, which plays into our 8th principle, as well as our 1st. Racism in Canada is individual or systemic behavior that prevents Black and Indigenous persons and other persons of color from having equitable access to society's resources. Our speaker today coined the terms Uni-versity and Poly-versity. At one end of the continuum, Uni-versity, a dominant group uses its power not only to ensure their own health and wealth, but also to ensure that non-members have reduced or even been in denial of health and wealth. At the other end, Poly-versity, that's way up here, all people are able to maximize their own and society's health and wealth. Our guest speaker moves groups along the path to Poly-versity. Arnold Minors is owner of Arnold Minors and Associates, a consulting firm formed in 1984. He was the City of Toronto's first ever management consultant, where he redefined community safety to include social justice for all. As a policy development officer, he has served as press secretary to the Premier of Bermuda. He's the only Canadian ever elected to the Board of Trustees of the Organization Development Network, and president of Ontario Association for Family Mediation. He's been an appointee to the Toronto Board of Health and the Toronto Police Services Board, and he was the first chair of the board of the African Canadian Legal Clinic. Arnold was born in Bermuda and immigrated to Canada in 1964. He holds a Bachelor of Science from McGill and an MBA from Queen's, and we're very, very pleased to have him here to talk to us today. Arnold?
Good morning, and thank you for the applause. I used to, particularly when I was a member of the Toronto Police Services Board, give a number of speeches at various places. And one time I began by saying, I'm here to speak and you're here to listen. And if anybody finishes before me, either leave or just raise your hand. And somebody at the back raised their hand, so I stopped doing that. So now I'm glad to have the applause at the beginning, because who knows what happens at the end. When I was young, my mother insisted that I attend church. So I rotated among 3 churches. She didn't specify where I had to go. It was just that I had to go. It was actually my sister and me. My brother wasn't even born at the time. And so I rotated between 3, an Anglican church, an AME church, and a Presbyterian church. For those of you who don't know, AME stands for African Methodist Episcopal, and it was a church founded in the 19th century. It's probably the only religious organization that was founded as a result of racial differences, tensions in the Presbyterian church, in the Methodist church, rather than on theological differences. In any event, I went to the AME church, and the reason I went there is because my godmother went there. My godmother is the most important person in my life. She's the one who can be, in some people's views, blamed for my continuing to do work in attempting to get justice, and in the view of others, credited for my doing so. And she insisted that when I was maybe 7 or 8, that since I'm a smart, low-colored boy, It's my job to make sure that this world is better for colored people after I die than while I was living. It's my job to make it better, do whatever I can. Speaking of her, I want to thank Shelley. I could not sing. My godmother talked Mrs. Wilkinson into letting me join the Amy Junior Choir. And Miss Wilkinson was very gracious because my godmother was influential in the church. And so she asked me to quietly sing to her. It was kind of audition. And so at the end of my brief audition, she said, yes, your godmother wants you to be in the choir so you can, but what I want you to do is to mouth the words. I knew I couldn't sing. She clearly understood I couldn't sing. So my godmother, however, who knew I couldn't sing, she said what she wanted me to do is to learn the words to the, as it was called then, Negro National Anthem by James Weldon Johnson and Rosamond Johnson. All three stanzas, not just the first one. And she said, since you can't sing, what I want you to do is to play it on the piano. So I started playing it, and playing it at the speed at which I'd heard people sing it. And my godmother said, no, 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 no. It is an anthem. It is not a funeral dirge. I want you to play it like an anthem. So Shelley, thank you for honoring my godmother and singing it like an anthem. The other thing that I want to say is the land acknowledgement. It makes me crazy. Here's why. The first time I heard it, I had come back from my gig in Bermuda as press secretary. And I had been invited to moderate a panel at, as it then was, Ryerson University, on racial profiling. That's probably none of you know about that because that ended, right? But this was back in 2011, years ago, when racial profiling still existed. And before I was invited to come up to moderate, a young man gave what was a land acknowledgement, and it was the first time that I had heard that in any audience. So it had been developing in the couple of years I was away from Toronto. And my reaction was, and at that time what they said was, we acknowledge that we're on the land of the whatever land it was that Ryerson is on. And so I said, if you're acknowledging you're on their land, give it back, or at least give them rent. This was a group of very progressive people, and my comment went over like the proverbial lead balloon. But one of the things that makes me think of is how much we are immersed in trying to get there but stopping short from real justice. And I don't know what it means, and I will talk a bit later about addressing these kinds of things in building an anti-racist organization. But I just want to raise it as a flag for all of us that every word that we speak in whatever language we speak it in, comes from somewhere, and if it is generally accepted, the chances are there's something wrong with it. There's something, if not wrong with it, at least something that should be questioned. If something gets generally accepted here, I worry about what it is. And I'm suggesting that all of us do. I'll come back to that. In the Pentecostal church, the Evening Light Pentecostal church, the third one that I went to, we read the Bible a lot. I think by the time I was 11, I had read the Bible 3 times. And I was an underachiever in this particular church. One story that's haunted me, it haunted me then and haunts me now, was the story of Nicodemus. Some of you may not have heard of him, but he was the guy who is said to have gone to Jesus one night and asked, "What do I have to do to be saved?" Well, I'm not going to talk about Jesus' response immediately, but the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King repeated part of that story when he was the keynote speaker at the 11th annual convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta in August the 16th, 1967, 5 or 6 months before he died. He entitled his speech, "Where do we go from here?" And he said in part, and I quote, "I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. Just as an aside, that's really what I mean when I'm saying every time you think about something, say something, we have to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace, but one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? There are words that must be said. Dr. King continued. And if you'll let me be a preacher just a little bit, one day, one night, a juror came to Jesus and he wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach of what you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, "Now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying." He didn't say, "Nicodemus, now you must not commit adultery." I make no comment about the recent resignation of a significant political figure. He didn't say, "Now, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that." He didn't say, "Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you're doing that excessively. He said something altogether different, because Jesus realized something basic, that if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. And Dr. King continued, and I'm saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, you must be born again. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. That's what being born again means. Starting from the beginning, doing what Shelley sang about. She called it roots, but that's really a radical act. Going to the root is radical. That's what radical means. So your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things, and therefore they will exploit them, and poor people generally. And a nation that will exploit economically will have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. And I'm saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, Canada, you would have said here, you must be born again. And so I conclude by saying today that we have a task, and let us go out with a divine dissatisfaction. This is Dr. King. Let us be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. Let us be satisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Let us be satisfied, he said, until those who live on the outskirts of hope are brought into the metropolis of daily security. Let us be dissatisfied. Let us be satisfied until slums are cast into the junk heaps of history and every family will live in decent sanitary homes. Let us be dissatisfied until warming places are open 24 hours a day. Let us be dissatisfied until integration is not seen as a problem, but as an opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. He didn't end there, but I'm going to continue my part. While Dr. King spoke of diversity as a desired state, I coined the terms as Sheila mentioned. Thank you for your introduction. I sometimes don't recognize myself. I have a friend, Zanena Akande. Some of you might know her. She was the first black minister of the Crown in Ontario. And she told me a story once about going to a funeral with her mother. And after a few minutes of people talking about this man, it was a dead man, her mother nudged Zanena and said, "We've got to leave here. I think we're in the wrong place." What they're saying about him. In any event, I coined the terms Uni-versity and Poly-versity to describe, as Sheila read in the introduction, two ends of a continuum of possibilities in society and its institutions. At one end, Uni-versity, uni-versity, a dominant group can and does abuse its power to ensure their own health and wealth. Here's the thing. A dominant group, in this case in Canada and Ontario, a group of English people who came here and decided we're going to stay, nice place, and we're going to conquer the heathen and take it over. So they created a place called Canada, Upper Canada, as though it had no name before, and used and abused their power to create a new society, for which we now have a government commission called the Truth and set up called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address, still incompletely, and certainly not concretely yet. And that dominant group abused its power, and they used their power. Why? For survival, for their own survival. They did anything, using Malcolm X's dictum, by any means necessary. And so they used education and guns and religion and all kinds of things to ensure that their ideology became the dominant one. And that if you wanted to live, you accepted it. And it became like fish, but it became like water. And we, like fish, live in it, and fish don't know water, at least until they're out of it. So the dominant group uses their power to ensure the continuation of its ideology. Some people call it white supremacy. I call it whiteness ideology. And it is designed to ensure survival. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing. It has bad impacts for those people who suffer under it. But that's at least my conclusion about the reason for it. People who buy into it do better than people who don't. Some of those people who don't buy into it wind up being killed, as Dr. Martin Luther King was. He didn't buy into it, and I'm as certain as my name is Arnold that a part of his assassination came from the support of the dominant group, if not the actual participation, so that he who was leading a movement would no longer be able to do that. He was taken out in the only way that they thought was effective. But his ideas continue. So in Poly-versity, everybody is able to maximize their own and society's health and wealth for the good of themselves and for the good of Mother Earth. In my opinion, therefore, Poly-versity is a desirable state. In it, the interconnectedness, the interdependence of all living beings is recognized. For organizations, I call the most extreme stage, Uni-versity, a stage 1 organization. I call it an excluding organization. The excluding organization is an inflexible structure designed to maintain its dominance. At the other end, a polyverse organization is, I call it, an including organization, and it's stage 6. And as I understand it, you guys, Don Heights Unitarian Congregation, in your statement of principles, you want to become a stage 6 organization, an including organization. In fact, you have those words in your principle. The including organization reflects the contributions and interests of various groups in its mission and operations. All people in the organization are encouraged to ensure eradication of any kind of social oppression, any and every kind. That means that the including organization must deconstruct the entire premise of whiteness supremacy or whiteness ideology. And what is that premise, you ask? It is that whiteness is universal and benefits all. And the education system, or the propaganda system as I call it, is designed to make sure that people know that. This whole thing in the United States that's happening now, and to some extent we see it in some universities in Canada and discussions on the streets in Canada, this whole attack on critical race theory, that children ought not, white children ought not to be made uncomfortable by hearing about slavery. Doesn't say anything about what black children may be continuing to experience as a result of slavery. This kind of silencing is a part of reinforcing the ideology. If you can make the atrocities go away, then you can be relatively comfortable at talking about white privilege and the privileges, and have people forget the atrocities that went with that privilege. That is the thing that is really, truly distressing, and we need to continue to remember that premise that whiteness is universal and benefits all. Deconstruction is another name for transformation. Deconstruction gets you to be born again. I understand that the vision of Don Heights Unitarian Congregation is to be, in my words, a polyverse organization, as I just said. This morning I want to talk a little bit about some understanding I'm coming to about how to get there. Some of you may have seen the photo of me and my friend Donovan on the ad for my presentation today. I call him Lil Fella. I want Lil Fella to grow up in a world that I helped to change a little bit, because my godmother told me to, and I'm more afraid of her than I am of anybody else, which is why I keep doing it, notwithstanding some of the struggles that I have by doing it. So, as I said, I want to help him grow up and change the world a little bit. I want him to grow up in a world of justice, just like you do, even though you don't know him. My presentation was titled, Building an Anti-Racist Organization. On reflection, I think it should have been titled, Building a Polyverse Organization, with particular attention to race, but no matter. A big part of this huge task is to make sure we're talking about the same things. So I'll start by defining racism. Whatever you have as your definition of racism, today we'll use mine so that we have a shared one. And if you leave and you want to go back to using yours, that's okay. But actually, it's not okay. Use mine. If you've got a different one, let me know, and if necessary, I'll adjust mine in my next speeches. I'm hard to persuade, though. So I'll start by defining racism. In Canada, and that's important, racism is different in different places at different times. Whoopi Goldberg was right when she made her statement, because in the United States, Jews were not legally or in practice defined as a race. They were defined as Jews, they were defined as a religious group, they were defined in all kinds of ways. The same thing is true in Canada. So be very careful in talking about racism and do not generalize it. So in Germany, for example, the Jews were characterized in the 30s, in the 20s, 30s, before that, as a race, as an inferior race, and the Aryans as a superior race, defined themselves as a superior race. And so the Holocaust that resulted was clearly a racist act. Whatever actions are taken against Jewish people in North America may be anti-Semitic, I guess, or anti-Jewish, or whatever it is, but it is not racism by the definition that I'm using. So racism in Canada is discrimination. First of all, it's a discrimination. It's a form of discrimination. It is sustained by use and abuse of power of a dominant group. The targets are people of color and indigenous people. And racism is determined by the impact on the victims and not by who does it or the intent of who does it. So when somebody says the killing of the black man in Memphis by 5 black cops wasn't racist because the cops were black, that's nonsense. If he was killed because he was black, their behavior of the cops, notwithstanding they were black, is racist. Racism is determined by impact, not intent. It's determined not by who does it. So when people say women can't be sexist, that's nonsense. Women can be sexist if they discriminate against other women because they're women. As some women won't hire other women because they don't want competitors or they think that unlike them, too many women are emotional or whatever. So sexism has the same kind of definition. It's discrimination against women sustained by power of the dominant group, in this case men, and it's determined by the impact on the women and not by who does it or the intent. So that definition is important, I think, that we share. In Canada, the dominant group's key social identities are white, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christian, English-speaking, higher economic class men. So the dominant ideology in this country, in Canada, in Ontario, white, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christian, English-speaking, higher economic class men. So if you are a brown, bisexual, or brown lesbian, if you're blind, brown, blind, lesbian, Muslim, Farsi-speaking, poor woman, you're in serious trouble because you're so far away in all the social identities from the dominant group. I use the increasingly attacked critical theory as one way of helping me to assist others in deconstructing or transforming or rebirthing their organizations. Critical race theory is anchored in 5 key premises, 2 of which I'll mention. One is the intersection of race and racism with other forms of subordination or oppression. Intersection is important. In other words, it's not possible Sheila, what I'd like you to do is tell me about time. Thank you. In other words, it's not possible to have a meaningful conversation about race that doesn't take class into account. It's also impossible to have a meaningful conversation about class that doesn't take race into account. The second is to challenge the dominant ideology as being value-free and race-neutral, that is, colorblind. What that means is we must pay attention to every word we use to ensure that the value assumptions contained in each word are explicitly addressed. For example, on your website, I read that you are guided to live by 8 principles that you read earlier, one of which is the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. I'm willing to bet that there isn't a shared definition of what democratic process means among you. And if I'm wrong about that, and I'm prepared to be, if there is, I'm much more certain that it means something different for many people you talk to outside your congregation. For many people, democracy means the majority rules. I call that the tyranny of the majority. It's not democracy. Democracy means that people have a say in their government, in their governance. I also read on your website that the living tradition we share draws from many sources, including, and I quote, humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Another bet, or maybe just a question, is there a shared understanding that when many of us in Canada talk of science, we are unaware that it is a European definition of science that we generally accept, and there are other definitions, and some of those are in conflict. Language matters. We must pay explicit attention to who makes our generally accepted definitions, and that their agendas are ensuring their dominance. There's an old African proverb that says, until the lions have their own historians, histories of the hunt will glorify the hunter. Whiteness ideology is built into our lives. It surrounds us. As I said, fish don't know water. We are like those fish swimming in the water of whiteness ideology. We need to be alert to when we are encountering it, not to eliminate it. The upside of whiteness ideology is that it ensures its survival. The downside is that it excludes others. There are some aspects of whiteness ideology which are valuable at times. Let me briefly mention a few aspects of whiteness ideology and give some alternative ideologies that are often devalued, and I'll do these quickly. Whiteness ideology, perfectionism, criticism. Other ideologies, appreciation. Whiteness ideology, sense of urgency, immediacy. Other alternative, a longer view. Whiteness ideology, worship of the written word versus oral. Whiteness ideology, paternalism, power over versus power with. Either or thinking versus both and thinking. Power hoarding versus power sharing. Individualism competition versus relationships cooperation. Objectivity versus subjectivity. Objectivity is a value, not something that in and of itself is of value. Linear versus circular, one God versus many gods, male supremacy versus male-female equality, survival of the fittest preference, with a preference for able-bodied versus all lives matter, individual land ownership versus community stewardship. And that's the thing that I was referring to earlier about the difference between white people coming here and saying this land is mine because they have a notion of land ownership, which is not a universal thing. The indigenous people had a notion of stewardship of this land and paying attention in the Mohawk tradition to the impact of decisions down to the 7th generation. I don't expect you to remember that list, but I guess you can go to the Zoom. I will finish quickly with a quote from the end of Dr. King's speech. What I'm suggesting that you do is to pay attention to everything that you do, every word that you use, and think about what it means. This is hard to do. Math is hard, but we do it. Driving a car is hard, but we do it. Living is hard, but we do it. Raising children is hard, but we do it. I went to get my clothes to come here, and Lil Fellow was with me yesterday, and I've just moved, and I put my clothes in a closet which has a lock on it that I've never used, and Lil Fella locked it. So all I had were the clothes that were in my laundry basket, which explains how I'm dressed today. Anyway, raising children is hard. I love him. I'm going to kill him, though. What I'm proposing to you to move to a polyverse organization is hard, but we can do it. We must do it. Closing of Dr. King's speech. I must confess, my friends, that the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will still be rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will, he said, be inevitable setbacks here and there. And there will be those moments when the buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our ethereal hopes blasted. We may again, with tear-drenched eyes, have to stand before the coffin of some courageous civil rights worker whose life will be snuffed out by the dastardly acts of bloodthirsty mobs. But difficult and painful as it is, we must walk in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds of despair, and when our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, let us remember there is a creative force in this universe working to pull down the gigantic mountains of evil, a power that is able to make a way out of no way and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Arnold. And